Okay, so today we're going to start our course by talking about 14th century Italian art. That's from the years 1300 to 1400. Let's start by looking at a map. This is Italy around 1400, and as you can see, there is no such thing as Italy as we understand it today. The Italian peninsula was divided into a series of small city-states, some of which were republics like Florence and Siena, which you can see in the middle, the green and purple. And those are the two that we'll be talking about primarily today. But there's also some duchies, right? The Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States. These are all separate political entities that are often in conflict, and Italy doesn't actually become a unified country until the 19th century, so not until 400 years later or so. I'm going to give you a little bit of background into what's going on here. In the 1300s, there is the Black Death, essentially the bubonic plague, which decimated the population of Italy and really Europe. It was thought that it eliminated between 25 and 50% of the population of Europe in about 5 years. The higher percentages of populations that were in cities certainly were affected since they were in close quarters. And this is important for us because it stimulates the production of religious art. Right? People who are afraid of dying tend to produce more religious art. We also have the development of what we call vernacular literature, or literature written and published in a local language. In this case, of course, it's in Italian, specifically in the Tuscan dialect common in Florence. And this is as opposed to Latin, which was the official language of the church and state. And by printing things in the vernacular, right, in a language that everyone understands, as opposed to Latin, which is the language of, the people who are highly educated, that gives much more accessibility to ideas. So for those of you who know literature, we start to see the work of people like Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Dante, of course, also presents to us the value of classical heritage. It is Virgil, the ancient Roman poet of the Aeneid, who leads him through the 3 parts of his journey in the Divine Comedy. And so we see in this literature not only an interest in the classical heritage that will eventually become the Renaissance, but also that's kind of a signal of the division from the church, since Latin was the language of ecclesiastical learning and Tuscan was the language really of the people, right, of sort of human learning. This is in response to this also development of humanism, right, a growing concern with human values and interests as distinct from but not opposed to religion's otherworldly values. And there are lots of different elements to humanism. It's kind of this amorphous term, but basically, there's this emphasis on education and expanding knowledge, this exploration of individual potential, this commitment to civic and moral virtue, and all of this is, again, this starting to break free from the hold that the church had, the Christian church had, over the Middle Ages, right? And so this is this very slow but important kind of incremental move away from that stronghold. What we see is that this will lead to the Renaissance, right? The rebirth of interest in the Greco-Roman classical heritage. And so we see this revival of literature, art, architecture that comes from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And remember that these forms had largely been dismissed during the Christian Middle Ages because of its association with the pagan religion. And so because of that, we see this recovery of ancient texts, this recovery of ancient art, and this interest in those older forms. So in the visual arts, we see then also this growing interest in naturalism, which is a style of painted or sculpted representation that's based on close observation of the natural world. And so we see this interest in the physical remains of the classical past and statuary and architecture that are around Italy, just because. And we also see this interest in the depiction of anatomical accuracy, but also spatial accuracy, basically to try to create an illusionistic extension of the viewer's world in the usually painted or sculpted surface. So all of this will come together, and this unit here, this 14th century Italian, is not quite the Renaissance yet. We haven't quite gotten there, but it's really starts kind of the building blocks of what will become the Renaissance at some point. We're going to start in the town of Siena, which was a banking and commercial center. And I just brought in some images of Siena. As you can see, to this day, it remains essentially a medieval town. You know, this sort of walled small city center. On the left, there's the Palazzo Pubblico, the town hall. On the right is Siena Cathedral. And we're going to start by talking about an altarpiece, right? And I wanted to define what that was for you first. An altarpiece is an object that has a liturgical sort of didactic purpose, right? Meaning that it's usually a painting, sometimes it's a sculptural relief, that is typically located behind the main altar of a church, right? So the main altar is the table upon which, you know, the priest does stands behind and does his thing, and it's behind him as he's speaking, and it's intended to serve as this backdrop to the ceremony of the Mass, right? The Mass, of course, in Christian theology is this ritual celebration of the Holy Eucharist, the story of the Last Supper, and there's kind of the prayer, the contemplation of the Word of God, and the reenactment of the Eucharistic sacrifice, the whole, bread and wine thing. So that's basically the backdrop to the Mass, is an altarpiece. And this is the altarpiece that was located in Siena Cathedral. This is the Virgin and Child enthroned with saints by Duccio di Boninsegna. And we call him typically just Duccio. This is really just the center panel of a much larger altarpiece called the Maesta altarpiece. And the center panel in and of itself is 7 feet tall by 13 feet wide. So as you can imagine, these altarpieces tend to be on a very, very large scale. This is what we would call a devotional altarpiece, meaning that it's meant to make you want to worship, right? It makes you want to venerate or worship the Madonna and Child, right? The Madonna, of course, is the Virgin Mary. The Child is the baby Jesus. Of course, this is all part of Christianity. And we know that the Madonna had a special place as a patron saint of Siena. We see her in the center here in her typical dark blue robe holding the infant Jesus. They're seated on a throne, and they're surrounded by angels and saints. And these saints are kind of identified to us by various things that they hold or garments that they wear, so that we can generally recognize who they are. But we're not going to focus too much on them. We're going to focus more on the Virgin and Child today. The Maesta altarpiece is a term that means, the term Maesta means majesty, and again, it's meant to suggest the veneration, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that you're meant to just worship it. It's not really meant to tell a story, right? You're just meant to kind of bow down in front of it, sort of. At the bottom of the throne, we see, you can just make out that there's a little bit of writing right on the kind of edge there. And, of course it's in in Latin, but translated it says, Holy Mother of God, be the cause of peace to Siena and of life to Duccio, because he has painted thee thus. And this is really significant for us because it's essentially kind of a signature, right? And Duccio is also asking, right, for the Virgin Mary to sort of help him out because he put so much work into this. And so we see to some degree the status of the artist becoming more of a thing in the pre-Renaissance here. We see that the figures are all sort of lined up. They all have halos, and to some degree they're overlapping, right? So there is some attempt at creating a sense of space, and yet they're stacked in a way that the halos don't cover anyone's faces, so that everyone can see sort of everyone as they're depicted here. This is made with tempera and gold leaf on wood panel. Tempera is a kind of medium in which the pigment, right, the ground up pigment, is mixed with egg yolk. And gold leaf is essentially gold, like the gold that you use for jewelry, but it's beaten into tissue paper thin sheets that are then applied to the surface, often in decorative patterns. And that's what we have the halos made of and the background made of. And a lot of altarpieces have this gold space in their background to kind of signify a sort of heavenly space. So that's the medium, right? And a lot of these early altarpieces were made on wood instead of canvas, right? We don't really see canvas coming until a couple hundred years later. I wanted to point out that, here we have this detail of Duccio's altarpiece, that this format comes from the Byzantine period, right? Particularly their icons, which are much smaller panel paintings that are also meant to be an object of worship. And so you can see that the basic blueprint, right, of the Madonna and Child, the Virgin and Child here, and the way that she tilts her head, the way that the baby is seated, that all comes from this long tradition stemming from, the 600s, 700s, 800s, that Duccio is still trying to kind of maintain that idea, right, that blueprint of, this easily recognizable figure. And yet we see him kind of expanding that into a much larger altarpiece that, again, has more interest in showing space. However, not all altarpieces have to be devotional. Some of them are narrative and include a story, a scene typically from the Bible. This is the case for Simone Martini's Annunciation altarpiece, also located in the Siena Cathedral, also made of tempera and gold leaf on wood. And this is, again, just the center panel, and it's 10 feet by 8 feet, right? So, again, on a relatively large scale. Simone Martini was a pupil of Duccio's, right? So also living in Siena. And he's known for his brilliant colors, his lavish costumes, this sort of intricate ornamentation. And he shows the scene of the Annunciation. And this is a scene from the Bible in which the angel Gabriel has just landed. And we see the breeze sort of lifting his mantle, right? He wears this gown of heavenly gold, and he kneels before the Virgin Mary. As he's kneeling, he announces to the Virgin Mary that she will bear the Son of God, right? So this is the annunciation to Mary of the fact that she will become the Virgin Mary and the mother of Jesus. She's in the middle of reading her book of devotions, and she shrinks demurely at his unexpected presence. And this image, particularly this center scene here, is one that, again, is a kind of blueprint, right? So as we'll see over and over again, that these key features, right, the angel Gabriel, the Virgin Mary, and also the vase of white lilies that are between them that signify her purity, her virgin status, are, again, part of this blueprint of what an Annunciation scene should be. We see again a gold background, a marble floor. She's seated on a gold throne. And so they're in a kind of courtly space, right? We see these elongated figures, and it might remind you from Art 221 that they are part of this international style that is associated with the late Gothic court style. Right, and so other features, of course, of the altarpiece still retain some sense of the Gothic, certainly in the framing of the wood, right, this intricate carving that's also covered in gold leaf. We see the pointed arches and the spires that we associate with Gothic cathedrals and cathedral building. So these are, again, this is kind of this transitional period between the medieval, right, and the Gothic into what will become the Renaissance. And I wanted to bring up this detail so that you can see the intricacy also of the gold work. You can see the halos around them are punched, right? Meaning that they have this, the gold is shaped into detail. And between them, you see words, right? And these are the actual words of the Annunciation. And those words are part of, you know, how she essentially is impregnated. And so they're depicted here sort of, again, in gold leaf as a relief on the actual object. Now we're going to turn to Florence. Florence is a neighboring city of Siena. They are both republics. And it's in Florence that we will see the birth, really, of the Renaissance. And so we're going to look at some of the altarpieces and other works of art here that will kind of lead us towards the early Renaissance. We're going to start with these two altarpieces, one by Cimabue. This is the Madonna enthroned with angels and prophets, and one by Giotto di Bondone, right? Which again we typically just call Giotto, and this is his Madonna enthroned. As you can see, they're relatively the same shape. They're also just one panel of what was probably a much larger altarpiece. They're both tempera on wood, and they both retain the same kind of imagery that the Duccio altarpiece had, right? We have the Virgin Mary seated on a throne with the baby Jesus, and they are surrounded by a variety of angels or saints or prophets or some combination thereof. Both of them retain the gold background that signifies the heavenly space, and both of them try to show a sense of depth in terms of the architecture of the throne, right? That we get this sense of an actual sort of object in space. In the Cimabue, however, the angels are overlapping, but they're piled on top of one another. There's no real space between or around them. And in the Giotto, we see that the angels overlap, right? Their halos cut off their faces in a much more realistic depiction of actual space. The Cimabue also includes these Old Testament prophets that kind of sit below the throne. They're holding scrolls, and these prophets are the ones who prophesied the coming of Jesus, right? And so essentially what they're trying to convey is that the New Testament figures of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus are built on the foundations of these Old Testament stories. But that creates this very confusing sense of space below the throne because it doesn't seem like it's really resting on a solid ground because those figures are underneath it. The angels look like maybe they're holding it aloft, and yet there is, you know, it does seem to touch down, at least in the front, on some sort of space. So the spatial accuracy here is maybe not perfect, right? And it's with Giotto that we start to see much more of this sense of accuracy. I want to talk a little bit about Giotto first. He's a student of Cimabue's. He is famous in his own time. Both Cimabue and Giotto are present as characters in Dante's Purgatory, which is book 2 of the Divine Comedy. And Dante actually knows these guys and writes about them, and he says, in painting, Cimabue thought he held the field, and now it's Giotto they acclaim, the former only keeps a shadowed fame, right? And basically what he's saying is that Giotto, as Cimabue's student, has sort of eclipsed his fame, has become the more famous one. We know a little bit about the story of Giotto because of this, what is probably a fictional tale retold in Vasari. Vasari was a famous biographer who wrote the lives of the artists from this period. And the story kind of goes, as a boy tending sheep, Giotto drew the image of a sheep on a rock. And at that moment, Cimabue, already an artist, happened to walk by and instantly recognized the talent in the boy and took him on as an apprentice immediately. And that's how he sort of rose to fame. And even though these stories are probably somewhat fictionalized, I brought it up because it tells kind of an important story about artistic training in this time period and in Renaissance Italy. Essentially, young boys would be apprenticed to master artists for typically 5 to 7 years. They lived with them, they learned the trade while doing all of the grunt work, right? Doing the grinding of pigments, the preparing of panels, laying plaster, drawing, etc. And this system was overseen by what we call an artist guild, which was essentially like a union. And they ensured that only the most talented artists could eventually join the guild, and by doing so, they sort of controlled the number of artists who could compete for jobs. And Giotto is best known for his new emphasis on observation and on naturalism, and for that he's sometimes considered the father of the Renaissance. So we see in Giotto's work the importance of the kind of sculptural solidity and weight to the figures, especially the Madonna, right? We can see, for example, a much greater sense of three-dimensional volume in her body because of the way that he uses light to highlight the areas of her breast, the parts of her knees that kind of jut out, and because of that we get a much greater sense of a person that sits there rather than in comparison an almost kind of cartoon-like figure that the Cimabue Madonna represents. Again, his accuracy of space is also important to him, to the point where, while the other altarpieces that we've seen have angels or saints that kind of are stacked on top of each other, so as not to overlap too much their faces, in the Giotto we see that not only do the halos overlap their faces, but the throne itself kind of cuts people off, right? And that creates an image that suggests a much more real sense of optical space because of the imperfections that exist in terms of things that obscure. In Giotto, the throne is placed clearly on a floor that is more kind of, again, solid and weighty. And the children, the Christ child in Giotto's looks more like an actual baby, whereas Cimabue's looks a little bit more like just a tiny human. And so we see with Giotto, a kind of chubbier cheek, rolls of baby fat, right? That there's a greater sense of an actual baby there. And so we start to see that Giotto becomes sort of famed for rendering nature a little bit more faithfully. Finally, I want to talk about a huge project that Giotto took on, right? So the same guy. And this is the Arena Chapel, also known as the Cappella Scrovegni, after its patron. This is located in Padua, which is a little bit south of Venice in Italy. And so here on the left you can see the actual chapel and then the interior. And we're going to talk about one key image from that, actually two, but we're going to start with this one, the Lamentation. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the town and a little bit about the fresco technique. So Padua is a town that had been a Roman settlement back in the time of ancient Rome. And it's called the Arena Chapel because it lies on the site of what was once a Roman arena, essentially a kind of Colosseum. Padua was also the site of a very old and well-respected university, and so it was one of the centers of the revival of classical culture. And it's thought that Giotto might have actually designed the building himself, right, as the architect, because it works so perfectly with his interior visual program. It's basically a simple barrel-vaulted hall that only has windows on the east end, so that the other walls can be completely covered, sort of floor to ceiling, as you can see, with these paintings. There are 38 framed paintings on 3 levels. The top level has scenes from the life of the Virgin and her parents. The middle level has the life and mission of Christ. And the bottom level has the passion, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ. Below the narrative scenes are these panels that feature the virtues and vices. And you can kind of see them a little bit better on the image on the right. They are painted in what is known as grisaille, which are essentially faux sculpture, right? Fake sculpture. It's basically a painting painted in gray tones to make it look like it's a sculptural relief, but it's not. It's just a fake painting. And so you can see that the other parts of the wall are painted also to look like fake marble, but it's not. It's just all completely painted in that way. And so let's talk a little bit about how that painting is done. It's created in what we call buon fresco, right, which essentially means good fresco, also known as true or wet fresco, and it's an Italian word. Buon, like buongiorno, right, means good day in Italian, and so buon means good. And this is a technique of painting on a wall where pigments, right, again, the powdered pigment, is mixed with water, and it's applied to freshly laid wet plaster. And as long as it's applied to wet plaster, as the plaster dries, the pigment becomes chemically bound to the plaster as it dries, therefore becoming part of the wall. So basically, the pigment won't chip off the surface because it's not on the surface anymore. It actually like physically joins with the wall, and so it lasts for a very, very long time. Part of why it's called good fresco. The downside is that artists have to work very quickly because it only works that way if they apply the pigment while the plaster is still wet. And so therefore they only work on small areas at a time, and this area is called a giornata, literally in Italian, a day's work. And so again, like buongiorno is Italian for good day, right? So we have buon fresco and giornata, right? So you can see where those words come from. As you can see on this image, the areas here for you are numbered. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And you can see that the faces of the people are their own giornata, right? So, and that's because faces take a lot more detail and a lot more time to paint, and so the areas are much smaller, right, that they can cover in a day's time in this way. So that's how these things are painted. Let's look then at the Lamentation, right? So this is one of these scenes, and this is a story that comes from the Bible again. This is after Christ has been crucified. He is taken down from the cross, and the Virgin Mary, here of course again in dark blue, cradles Christ, right? Cradles Jesus, the dead body of Jesus, and weeps over it, right? And so we call it the Lamentation because they're lamenting the death of Christ. Other figures who are part of the scene, in a kind of typical blueprint of the scene, are the Mary Magdalene, who is seated at Christ's feet, holding his feet, and John the Evangelist, who is the beardless man, who is standing and throwing his arms back in grief. The figures are about half life size because each of these panels is about 6 feet by 6 feet square. And so they're relatively large. Like many of Giotto's scenes on this narrative sequence, right, this sequence of telling the stories from the Bible, it's arranged kind of like a stage set, a very narrow stage-like space in which the action occurs. And this idea of the stage set comes from what we call mystery plays that were usually presented in city squares where actors acted out biblical narratives as these kind of simple scenes, and these mystery plays were sponsored by the Franciscan monks. There are a couple of important innovations here as well. First of all, we see that this space is not a heavenly space. It doesn't have the gold background that we associate with heavenly space, but because it's a story that happens on Earth, we actually see it happening in a landscape. So the sky is blue, which is kind of new for us. And we see this rocky landscape in the background that leads our eye down to the head of Jesus and the sort of central scene of the Virgin Mary cradling her dead son. We see that at the top of this kind of craggy rock, there is this kind of dead tree. And it's thought to be that this tree is maybe the same tree from the Garden of Eden. Of course, the Garden of Eden is the story of, in the Old Testament, of the fall of man and original sin. And basically, it's the reason why Christ must be sacrificed, right? So it's included here to remind us why he had to die in the first place. We see angels up in the heavens who are foreshortened, right? Basically, it's a term that we use to describe kind of a use of perspective to represent something that's extending, that's supposed to be, we understand it to be extending back into the space of the painting, right? But all we really see in some of them are their sort of heads and torsos, and we understand that they don't not have bodies, right? That they do in fact have bodies, but that they are, that we can't really see them from the angle that we're standing because they're extending back into space. So that's what we call foreshortening. And we see that they're all reacting, right? They're all sort of writhing in agony. And we see this variety of responses, right? From the angels to John the Evangelist, to the other figures who are standing around, and the Virgin Mary herself. And there's a real emphasis on trying to humanize this religious story, right? That we see this mother cradling her son who looks grief-stricken, and Giotto's, has this interest in showing this kind of emotional naturalism as well as bodily naturalism or spatial naturalism. We see the bodily naturalism emphasized by the use of modeling, right? And basically, we can see these figures, especially the two in the front that are seated facing away from us, the gradations of light and shade on their garments conveys a sense of three-dimensional volume, right? A sense of three-dimensional solidity on what is a two-dimensional surface, right? So using that sense of modeling to give volume to figures, that's something that will, again, be developed more and more in the Renaissance. These figures that face away from us also break with this Byzantine tradition of everything being very frontal, right? And basically they serve as surrogates for the audience, right? We can imagine ourselves in their places participating in this scene, and that's very important for moving forward in terms of Christianity. Finally, I wanted to show you another scene from the Arena Chapel. This is the Last Judgment. You can see on the bottom left, it's the back wall of the chapel, and essentially is the last thing you would see before you exit through those doors. And even though this isn't in your textbook, I wanted to bring it up because I like it. And I also wanted to kind of tell you this little story. You can actually still go and see the Arena Chapel. I went a long time ago now when I was in college, and you actually have to go into a special room where they kind of play a video for you, and while they're playing the video, they kind of blow air on you to get particles away from your body so that you don't track in too much into the Arena Chapel to sort of damage the painting. But again, I just wanted to bring this up as, you know, this is an actual place that you can actually go and visit if you ever make it out to Italy. Anyway, this is the Last Judgment. We can see at the very top the angels roll away the sun and the moon and heavens like a scroll to reveal the gates of paradise. We have Christ at the center in his kind of body halo, which we call a mandorla, and he's surrounded by angels, and on either side of him seat the apostles in a single row. And I brought up a detail of Christ because it's the Last Judgment. Basically, what that means is in the Bible, this is his moment of deciding who gets to go to heaven and who has to go to hell. And so we see in his hand gestures to the left, right, to our left, I guess, to his right, we see the blessed, right, and he opens his palm to them, welcoming them. And to our right, his left, we see hell, right, those who are damned to hell. And so we see his hand turned around and he's kind of pushing them away almost, right? And so that signifies the kind of up or down vote, I guess. I like this painting because the imagery from hell is just hilarious and awesome. So let's look at some of that. This is a detail from hell, and basically, so we see this giant sort of blue monster, and he has these bodies of the souls who are damned, and he's just kind of munching on them like ar ar ar, as he's kind of swinging them around. And so we see various demons, right, sort of snake-like creatures. We see you know, kind of dragon-like creatures, and then other like blue demons who are torturing essentially the souls from hell. And I just love that. Also love that you can kind of make out right behind the cross, right? So this cross signifies the kind of line between those who are blessed and those who are damned. You can just make out here on the left that behind one of the crosses there's this little soul who wants to try to sneak across, and it's probably not going to work out. But I bring in this image because we have a really significant part of that, which is I've blown up for you on the right, and that's Enrico Scrovegni, right? Enrico Scrovegni is a Paduan merchant, and he's the patron. He is the one who buys, commissions, you know, pays the artist Giotto to produce this chapel. It's his chapel, and he does that because his family is a family of bankers, and many of the punishments associated with hell in this image relate to the sin of usury, which is money lending, right? And for those of you who know Christian theology, money lending is a sin, right? It's a mortal sin, essentially, in Christian theology. And so Enrico's father is actually featured in Dante's Hell for this sin, for the sin of money lending. And so Scrovegni, who's a little bit afraid of going to hell, decides to present himself in the image, offering up to the angels what appears to be actually the Arena Chapel, right? And I brought back this image of the Arena Chapel so you can see how much it looks just like it. So what we have here is what we call a donor portrait. It's a portrait of the individual who commissioned to asked an artist to pay for, or to make and paid for, a religious work of art that's usually as evidence for their devotion to God, right? And in this way, by spending all of this money on this chapel for religious reasons, he's trying to use art as a way to expiate his sin, as a way to kind of keep him on the balance of the blessed, right, rather than the damned. And as you can see, he's kind of close to that middle mark there. But ideally, the chapel has pushed him onto kind of the side of the blessed. So that's it for this lecture, 14th century Italian. Next time we're going to talk about 15th century Flemish and keep going from there. All right.